Before the treasure hunters and the television cameras, before the drills and the dynamite and the millions poured into the earth, there was just a boy and a strange depression in the ground. The year was 1795. The boy was Daniel McGinnis. The island was a wooded, uninhabited mound in Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia, a place the local population regarded with a quiet, ancestral unease that no one had ever bothered to explain. McGinnis noticed a shallow sinkhole beneath an oak tree whose branch bore the scar of a removed tackle block. Something had been lowered here. He returned with two companions, Anthony Vaughan and John Smith, and the three began to dig. What they found did not belong. At 2 feet, a layer of fitted flagstones. At 10 feet, a platform of oak logs wedged tightly into the clay walls of the shaft. They hauled the timber out and continued. 10 feet deeper, another platform, then another. The intervals were exact. Every 10 feet, oak. Between the platforms lay compressed strata of charcoal, ship's putty, and coconut fiber. Each material was selected for a purpose: moisture resistance, structural integrity, organic preservation. This was not a hole. It was architecture. The teenagers eventually abandoned the effort, overwhelmed by the scale of what they had exposed. But even at that shallow depth, the implication was staggering. The shaft was not improvised. And as it followed an engineering logic that required planning, labor, and materials sourced from beyond the North Atlantic, yet there was no name attached to it, no claim filed in any colonial registry. No family story passed through generations of settlers. Whoever built this shaft invested extraordinary effort and then vanished from the record entirely, leaving behind only the work itself and the silence surrounding it. The boys told people what they had found, and people came. For the next 200 years, they never stopped coming. What changed was only the scale of the eventual failure. The Onslow Company mounted the first organized excavation in 1803, hiring professional diggers who cut past the oak platforms and descended to nearly 90 feet. Then, overnight, the shaft filled with seawater. Not a trickle, a surge. Within hours, the pit held 60 feet of salt water, and no amount of bailing could lower it by even an inch. The workers believed they had struck an underground river. They were wrong. What they had struck was something far more deliberate. Later investigation revealed a system of flood tunnels radiating outward from the shaft to the shore at Smith's Cove, where an artificial beach of coconut fiber and flat stones concealed the intake points. Seawater was channeled through these tunnels on a gravity feed, triggered the moment excavation breached a certain depth. The pit was not merely deep, yet it was defended, and this did not discourage anyone. The Truro Company arrived in the 1840s, drilled through the flood line with a pod auger, and reportedly brought up fragments of gold chain and loose metal before the water consumed the entire borehole. In 1861, a steam engine collapse killed a digger. The Oak Island Association reorganized in the 1860s and failed again. Franklin Roosevelt joined a syndicate in 1909 that went nowhere. By the 1960s, Jew Robert Dunfield had carved away entire sections of the island with industrial cranes, obliterating surface evidence in a desperate attempt to outmuscle the engineering below. He found nothing he could keep. 2 centuries of ambition met the same ending: flooding, collapse, retreat. The mechanism never failed. It performed with a consistency that embarrassed every generation that challenged it. And embedded in that consistency was an unsettling confession from the original builders. They knew someone would come, and they built for centuries of resistance. If Oak Island were truly a singular anomaly, the historical record should reflect that singularity cleanly. One island, one mystery, one location. But the earliest written accounts of the discovery do not cooperate with that version. They suggest something important was edited out. Between 1803 and the 1860s, a handful of newspapers across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick ran independent stories about the Oak Island excavations. These were not copies of one another. They carried different details, different sources. But threaded through several was a reference that later printings would quietly discard, a mention of a second location somewhere along the Atlantic coast where similar underground disturbances had been observed. One account spoke of stone formations arranged in deliberate patterns on another island, noted by sailors who recognized the resemblance to what had been described at Oak Island. Another referenced oral testimony from Mi'kmaq elders who distinguished between two sites, not one, both associated with buried foreign works, predating European settlement. A third mentioned unusual soil depressions reported by surveyors working the coastline further north. These passages were not dramatic. They were incidental, almost parenthetical, and perhaps that is why no one protested when they disappeared. Later editions of the same newspapers reprinted the Oak Island accounts with those references cleanly excised. No corrections were issued, no retractions. The references simply stopped existing in print. What remains is a silence shaped exactly like a decision. Somebody reviewed those early accounts and determined that the mention of a second site was not fit for repetition. That is not how errors are treated. Errors are corrected publicly. This was something else. This was material deemed unsuitable for the version of the story the public was allowed to keep. Consider what it takes to keep a secret among thousands of men. Not a whispered rumor passed between two courtiers, but a coordinated operational directive distributed across an entire kingdom, synchronized to execute on a single date, at a single hour, in every jurisdiction simultaneously. Had been prepared weeks in advance, sealed and delivered to the king's household. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only place where the arrest warrants could be read. The king's household was the only had been prepared weeks in advance, sealed and sent to royal agents in every province, with strict instructions not to open them before the appointed day. When dawn broke on that Friday, soldiers across France moved in coordinated silence against every known Templar commandery, chapter house, and estate. Thousands of knights, sergeants, and servants were seized before most of them even understood what was happening. The charges were heresy, blasphemy, and obscene rituals, accusations that conveniently justified the total seizure of all Templar assets by the crown. Philip owed the Templars enormous sums of money. The order had functioned as his banker, his creditor, and at times his most dangerous political rival. Eliminating them solved several problems at once, but the operation was not merely punitive, it was acquisitive. Philip wanted the Templar treasury. His agents had specific instructions to locate and secure the order's vast financial reserves held at the temple in Paris, the fortified complex that served as the nerve center of Templar banking across all of Europe. They arrived to find the vaults empty, not partially emptied, not hastily looted, empty. The treasury that had funded crusades, financed monarchs, and underwritten the most sophisticated financial network in the medieval world had been moved before the king's men crossed the threshold. This was not improvisation. Someone within the order had known what was coming and had acted in advance with enough precision to leave nothing behind. The question is not whether the Templars were warned. The question is where they sent what they removed. The Templar fleet was not a myth. It was an administrative fact. The order maintained a significant naval presence at the Atlantic port of La Rochelle on the western coast of France. These were not ceremonial vessels. They were working ships, cargo carriers, military transports, deep water craft capable of open ocean voyages. Port records confirm that in the days immediately before October 13th, 1307, the fleet was docked and accounted for. By the morning of the arrests, it was gone. Not a single ship remained. No harbor master recorded a departure order. So no manifest listed cargo or destination. No crew roster was filed. The fleet simply ceased to exist in the documentary record, as though the ships had slipped moorings and sailed into a gap between sentences. This is not a small detail. A fleet of that size, estimates range from 18 vessels to over 24, requires provisioning, crewing, and navigational planning. You do not move that many ships in secrecy without advance coordination. Whoever ordered the departure knew the arrests were imminent and acted with enough lead time to load, crew, and launch an entire flotilla under cover of darkness. What deepens the mystery is the silence on the receiving end. The Mediterranean was a well-documented theater of maritime movement. Atlantic ports along the Iberian coast, the British Isles, and Scandinavia maintained customs and harbor logs, and not one recorded the arrival of a Templar vessel in the weeks or months following October 1307. The fleet did not dock anywhere that kept records. That leaves two possibilities. Either the ships were scuttled at sea, which would mean the deliberate destruction of an irreplaceable naval asset, or they sailed somewhere beyond the reach of European record-keeping. Somewhere no harbor authority would log their arrival. Somewhere, perhaps, that the order already knew existed, but had never disclosed. The men who were captured did not break easily, And when they did break, they gave the Inquisition everything it wanted to hear about blasphemy, about idol worship, about rituals conducted in darkness. They confessed to spitting on the cross. They confessed to kissing the base of the spine. Under enough pain, they confessed to whatever was required. But on one subject, across hundreds of transcripts spanning years of interrogation, the answers were remarkably consistent. Just no one revealed where the treasury had gone. This was not scattered evasion. The transcripts show a pattern far more unsettling than simple resistance. Night after night, when pressed on the location of the Order's central reserves, offered the same essential response, that they did not know, that such matters were above their station, that the treasury had been managed by officers whose identities they could not confirm. The phrasing varied slightly. The substance did not. Inquisitors were trained to detect rehearsed testimony. They understood that identical answers from unrelated prisoners, questioned in isolation, pointed toward coordinated preparation. Yet the interrogations continued for years without producing a single actionable lead. No location was named, no route described, no agent identified. The treasury of one of the wealthiest institutions in Christendom had vanished. And the men who served that institution either could not or would not say where it went. There is a difference between those two possibilities, and it matters enormously. If the knights could not say, it means the treasury had been moved without their knowledge, compartmentalized so thoroughly that genuine confession was useless. If they would not say, it means the secret held under conditions designed to destroy every human threshold of endurance. Either explanation points toward something that was never meant to be found by European hands. There are maps that should not exist. They predate the voyages that supposedly discovered the lands they depict, and yet the coastlines they render are not guesses. They are Yarpajourian measurements, and when you trace the provenance of these maps backward through the centuries, the trail does not lead to explorers or royal cartographers. It leads to monasteries, maritime orders, and the intellectual margins of the medieval church, precisely the spaces where the Templars operated with the least oversight. Portolan charts were the navigational workhorses of the Mediterranean world, practical sea maps drawn from compass bearings and direct observation. Most of them depicted known waters, the coast of Europe, North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, but a small number of Portolan charts from the 13th and 14th centuries contain anomalies that have never been adequately explained. They show coastlines in the North Atlantic rendered with an accuracy that implies first-hand survey data. Harbor indentations, island clusters, and tidal shallows appear in positions that correspond with uncomfortable precision to the geography of Atlantic Canada. The most frequently cited of these is the Carta Pisana, though it is far from the only example. Others circulated among Genoese and Venetian navigators with known connections to Templar shipping networks. The order controlled or influenced a significant portion of Mediterranean maritime infrastructure, and its alliances with Italian seafaring families are well documented. If any institution possessed geographic intelligence beyond the acknowledged horizon of European knowledge, it was the Temple. Official history maintains that no European mapped the coast of Nova Scotia before John Cabot's voyage in 1497. That remains the accepted position, but these charts, drawn a century or more before Cabot ever sailed, depict landforms that closely match the very region where Oak Island sits. Either the cartographers invented features that happen to align with real geography by extraordinary coincidence, or someone had already been there and brought the measurements home. In 1558, a Venetian nobleman named Niccolò Zeno The younger published a set of letters and a map that he claimed had been written by his ancestors in the late 14th century. The letters describe voyages through the North Atlantic undertaken in the service of a prince named Zixmni, and they referenced islands, coastlines, and harbors in regions that European cartography would not officially reach for another 100 years. The publication ignited a debate that has never been settled. These skeptics have spent centuries dismantling the Zeno narrative. The map contains errors. Some island names cannot be matched to any known geography. The letters read, in places, like literary embellishment rather than navigational reportage. Entire academic careers have been built on the argument that the account is a 16th century fabrication designed to assert Venetian priority in Atlantic exploration, a patriotic forgery, nothing more. And yet the narrative refuses to die. Embedded within the questionable details are descriptions that no forger should have been able to produce. Coastal formations in the letters correspond to real features in the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and the northeastern seaboard of North America. Tidal patterns mentioned in passing align with conditions that only direct observation could confirm. The errors are real, but so are the accuracies. And no one has satisfactorily explained how a 16th century nobleman invented geographic data that turned out to be correct. What has received far less attention is a specific passage describing an island distinct from the primary landmass, situated further north where stone structures were observed partially buried beneath earth. Scholars connecting the Zeno narrative to Nova Scotia have typically tried to match this description to Oak Island, but the geographic coordinates implied by the text do not align with Mahone Bay. They point further up the coast to a place never formally surveyed, never excavated, and never named in subsequent European accounts. If the Zeno description is fabricated, this detail is meaningless. But if even a fragment reflects real observation, then the island it describes has been sitting in plain sight for over 6 centuries, unvisited and unquestioned. Numbers survive where narratives do not. In the margins of certain Templar-era documents, land deeds, correspondence between commanderies, administrative records preserved in ecclesiastical archives, independent researchers have identified numerical sequences that do not correspond to any known accounting or dating system. When analyzed as positional coordinates using methods consistent with medieval navigation, these sequences resolve into geographic locations. 2 of them point to Atlantic Canada. The first set aligns within a reasonable margin with Oak Island. This has been noted before, and while mainstream historians dismiss it as retrofitted pattern recognition, the mathematical case is not trivial. The numbers were flagged by cryptographers studying Templar administrative encoding who had no prior interest in Nova Scotia. The second set is the problem. It does not point to Oak Island. It does not point to any site in the published literature on Templar activity in the New World. It resolves to a location along the Atlantic coast, further north in a region that has attracted no archaeological attention and carries no historical associations with buried construction or early European contact. If the first coordinate set is coincidence, then the second is entirely irrelevant. But if the first is meaningful, if it genuinely encodes a location the Templars considered significant, then the second cannot simply be discarded. It must be either a companion site or a deliberate misdirection, and both possibilities carry weight. A twin site encoding would suggest the order did not entrust its most critical assets to a single location, a principle entirely consistent with Templar banking philosophy. No serious historian has addressed this pairing. The first set is occasionally debated. The second is not mentioned at all. From the air, Oak Island reveals nothing. It is a small wooded landmass, unremarkable in shape, indistinguishable from dozens of similar islands scattered along the Atlantic coast. But when surveyors began plotting the precise positions of the island's known features, the money pit, the stone triangle discovered on the southern shore, the locations of key boreholes drilled across 2 centuries of excavation, a pattern emerged that should not have been possible for a random distribution of sites. The positions conform to geometric ratios, not loosely, not approximately. And the spatial relationships between these points reproduce proportions found in Templar ecclesiastical architecture, the same ratios that governed the floor plans of Templar round churches, the positioning of altars within commandery chapels, and the layouts of the order's most sacred constructed spaces. These are not measurements imposed after the fact by enthusiasts looking for meaning. They have been independently verified by survey teams using modern instruments, and the margins of alignment are too consistent to attribute to chance. Sacred geometry was not decorative for the Templars. It was doctrinal. The order embedded mathematical relationships into their constructions as an expression of divine order, a practice inherited from earlier building traditions and guarded with considerable secrecy. A builder who employed these ratios was not simply an engineer. He was an initiate, someone trained within a specific intellectual lineage that valued precision as a form of devotion. This eliminates entire categories of suspects. Pirates did not build according to sacred proportion. Colonial settlers did not orient works along Templar architectural ratios. Whoever designed the layout of Oak Island's key features possessed knowledge that circulated within an extraordinarily narrow tradition. The geometry does not prove the Templars built it, but it proves that whoever did was drawing from the same body of knowledge, and that body of knowledge had very few inheritors. If Oak Island's geometric pattern existed in isolation, it could be debated endlessly. An anomaly without a comparison point, forever balanced between intention and coincidence. But it does not exist in isolation, and this is precisely where the investigation shifts from curiosity into something considerably more uncomfortable. I withheld, replaced by a coded designation withheld, replaced by a coded designation the surveyor never explained. What the notes do contain are measurements, distances between surface markers, angles between stone formations, ratios between points of interest arranged across the island's terrain, and these measurements, when plotted, produce a geometric footprint nearly identical to the one found on Oak Island. This was not a casual resemblance. The proportional relationships match to, within fractions of a degree, the same sacred ratios, the same architectural grammar that governed Templar construction appeared at both sites, separated by a distance significant enough to rule out any shared geological explanation. In the 1990s, a ground-penetrating radar survey was conducted in the vicinity of the second island as part of a broader coastal mapping initiative. The survey was not designed to investigate the site specifically, but the data it returned was unmistakable. Subsurface anomalies, voids, density changes, and linear formations consistent with constructed channels or chambers appeared at positions that corresponded precisely to the geometric grid implied by the surveyor's earlier notes. No formal excavation followed. No institution claimed the data. The radar results were archived without commentary, and the surveyor's notes remained unpublished until they surfaced in an estate collection decades later. Two sites built on the same invisible blueprint, separated by enough distance to suggest not duplication, but deliberate design. The question no one has publicly asked is the simplest one. Who had the knowledge, the resources, and the motive to build the same thing twice? There was one attempt to investigate the second site directly. It happened in 1965, and almost everything about it has been lost. What survives is fragmentary. A handful of references in private correspondence, a brief mention in a provincial geological bulletin that was never indexed, and the recollections of two individuals who claimed involvement but declined to provide sworn testimony. From these fragments, a thin but coherent account can be assembled. A small team, organized under the direction of a geologist affiliated with a maritime university, traveled to the second island in the summer of 1965 to collect soil and mineral samples. The expedition was not publicized, no press was informed, no permits appear in the provincial record, which either means they were granted informally or the expedition operated outside official channels entirely. The team reportedly spent less than a week on the island. They extracted core samples from several locations corresponding to the subsurface anomalies that would later be confirmed by the 1990s radar survey. According to the limited accounts that survived, the samples contained mineral deposits not native to the region, materials whose presence in coastal Nova Scotian soil would require either an extraordinary geological explanation or a human one. The results were never published. No paper was submitted to any journal. No institutional report was filed. The lead researcher returned to his university position and within 2 years was dead. The cause was recorded as natural, though the timing has invited speculation, never substantiated or fully dismissed. His personal files were not preserved by the university. His field notes have never surfaced. What remains is absence. An expedition that reached the site, retrieved physical evidence, and then dissolved into silence so complete that its existence can barely be verified. That silence is not neutral. Expeditions that find nothing produce reports saying so. Expeditions that find something inconvenient produce silence, and the silence surrounding the 1965 venture is total, which makes it paradoxically the loudest piece of evidence in this entire investigation. When the Templar order was dissolved in 1312, its members did not all burn at the stake. The executions were selective, theatrical, designed to demonstrate royal and papal authority, not to eliminate every single knight who had worn the Red Cross. Across Europe, thousands of former Templars were absorbed into other orders, pensioned into obscurity, or vanished from records entirely. In Scotland, where the papal bull of dissolution was never formally enforced, the absorption was quieter still, and it is in Scotland, within the earliest Freemasonic lodges, that the Templar thread reappears. The connection between the Templars and Freemasonry has been debated for centuries, often dismissed as a romantic fantasy, but the ritual evidence is difficult to ignore. Specific elements of Masonic initiation, the structure of oaths with the symbolic use of the temple, the hierarchy of degrees, mirror Templar ceremonial practices documented in Inquisition transcripts. These are not vague thematic resemblances. They are structural parallels and preserved in sequence and language, suggesting direct transmission rather than independent reinvention. The oldest Masonic lodges in Scotland appear in the record within decades of the Templar dissolution. Their founding members include stonemasons, but also men of unexplained means and obscure lineage, precisely the profile of Templar veterans quietly resettled. The lodges functioned as closed networks bound by secrecy, governed by internal codes, and organized around the symbolic construction of sacred space. If Freemasonry inherited the Templars' ritual architecture, the question becomes what else it inherited. Rituals can be preserved without understanding their original purpose, but knowledge, geographic knowledge, navigational knowledge, the coordinates of hidden sites across an ocean most Europeans did not yet acknowledge, that inheritance would not survive in ceremony alone. It would require a different kind of keeping. When the British Crown began distributing land grants in Nova Scotia during the 18th century, the process was, in theory, administrative. Settlers applied, authorities assessed, parcels were assigned. But theory and practice diverged in ways visible only when you map the grants geographically and cross-reference grantees against lodge membership records. Several of the earliest and largest grants in the Mahone Bay region were awarded to men whose names appear in the rolls of established Masonic lodges. Lodges in Halifax, Annapolis Royal, and Lunenburg. These were not casual affiliations. The men held officer-level positions within their respective lodges, meaning they were embedded in the upper tiers of an organization that prized hierarchical secrecy and selective knowledge sharing. What draws attention is not the Masonic membership itself. That Freemasonry was common among colonial elites, and lodge affiliation alone proves nothing. What draws attention is the geography. When the land grants held by these men are plotted on a map, they form a rough perimeter around two specific zones, one encompassing Oak Island, the other encompassing the approximate coastal area where the second site is believed to be located. The grants do not include the islands themselves. They encircle them. And this pattern resembles a buffer zone more than a settlement strategy. The surrounding land was claimed and controlled, but the islands at the center were left formally untouched. Never deeded, never developed, never entered into the colonial property system. If the goal was agriculture or commerce, claiming the islands would have been the obvious first step. They were left unclaimed precisely because claiming them would have created a public record, drawn attention, and invited inquiry. The perimeter held, the center remained invisible, and unless this arrangement was pure coincidence, a term that is becoming increasingly difficult to rely on, it suggests that someone with authority and Masonic connections understood exactly what those islands contained and chose concealment over possession. The Onslow Company is remembered as the first organized attempt to excavate Oak Island. In 1803, its workers descended into the money pit with tools and lumber, reaching depths the original teenage discoverers could never have managed. When the flood tunnels activated and the shaft filled with seawater, the company retreated, defeated by the same mechanism that would defeat every expedition after it. Standard history treats the Onslow Company as treasure hunters, optimistic, underfunded, outmatched. But the standard history does not ask who was paying. Provincial records from the early 19th century list the company's formation and stated purpose, but the identity of its financial backers is only partially disclosed. Several investors are named, others are referenced by initials or omitted entirely, shielded behind a corporate structure that was unusually opaque for the time. This alone would not be remarkable. Investor anonymity was common in speculative ventures. What makes it remarkable is what emerges when the named investors are traced through other records. At least 3 of the identified backers held documented affiliations with Masonic lodges in Nova Scotia. Yalawan held a senior position in a Halifax lodge whose charter traced its lineage to Scottish Freemasonry, the same Scottish tradition that carries the strongest Templar inheritance. These were not laborers chasing rumors. They were connected men operating within a fraternal network that had both the means and the institutional memory to know more about Oak Island than the public narrative suggested. This reframes the Onslow Company entirely. If its backers already possess knowledge of the site through Masonic channels, the excavation may not have been an exploration at all. It may have been a reconnaissance, a controlled operation to determine whether the original works had been compromised. Not a search for treasure, but an inspection of a vault whose existence they had always known about. In 2006, during renovation of a late colonial estate in Lunenburg County, Nova Scotia, workers removing wall paneling discovered a leather folio wedged between studs. Inside were 7 letters, folded, sealed, and never posted. The paper stock dates to the late 18th century. The ink is consistent with formulations common to that period. The letters were written by a single hand, addressed to recipients identified only by initials, and composed in a style blending formal English with intermittent passages of encoded text. The cipher in the encoded passages has been partially analyzed by researchers familiar with Masonic cryptographic conventions, and it conforms to substitution patterns documented in 18th century lodge communications, not standard ritual ciphers used in ceremonial work, but a less common operational variant associated with correspondence between lodge officers. These were not ritual documents, they were instructions. Among the decoded fragments, one phrase recurs across multiple letters. It reads, in translation, as the second work. The surrounding context suggests it refers to a specific physical undertaking, a site, a project, a location requiring protection. The tone is cautious, managerial, concerned with logistics and discretion. The phrase does not appear in any known Masonic ritual text, catechism, or degree lecture. It belongs to no recognized ceremonial vocabulary within the fraternity. This means it was either invented for private use or it belonged to a lexicon existing outside the ritual framework, an operational language used by men engaged in activities the lodge itself may never have formally acknowledged. The letters were never sent. Whatever the second work referred to, the author decided, for reasons now permanently unknowable, that even these carefully guarded words were too dangerous to transmit. Every expedition defeated by the Oak Island flood tunnels has described them in the same way, as a trap, a booby trap designed to drown out intruders and protect whatever lies beneath. This interpretation has held for over 2 centuries, and it makes intuitive sense. Water rushes in, excavation becomes impossible, treasure stays hidden. But there is another way to read the engineering, and it changes the entire nature of the question. Marine archaeologists who have studied the system note that its construction bears striking resemblance to hydraulic techniques when used in Mediterranean harbor engineering during the 12th and 13th centuries. These methods managed water flow around submerged structures, not to weaponize water, but to control it. The Templars, who operated one of the most extensive port networks in the medieval world, had direct access to this expertise. Their engineers managed harbors, maintained underwater foundations across the eastern Mediterranean. They understood water not as an obstacle, but as a building material. When this lens is applied to Oak Island, the interpretation shifts. The system does not merely flood the pit, it maintains constant hydraulic pressure below a specific depth, creating a sealed environment where atmospheric exposure is prevented. This is not a trap, it is a preservation mechanism designed to keep something submerged, sealed, and stable across centuries. This distinction matters profoundly. A trap protects gold, silver, coins, materials that do not degrade in air. A preservation system protects something else entirely. Organic material, parchment, vellum, wood, textiles, objects that would deteriorate the moment they met oxygen. If the flood tunnels are a seal rather than a weapon, then what they guard is not wealth, it is information. The builders understood that the contents were more fragile and perhaps far more valuable than any quantity of precious metal. The question that no one has formally posed is whether the Templars possessed anything worth preserving with this level of care. The answer, given the order's role as custodian of documents, relics, and knowledge accumulated across 2 centuries in the Holy Land, is uncomfortable in its obviousness. If the flood tunnel system on Oak Island were unique, an isolated feat of hydraulic engineering with no known parallel in Atlantic Canada, it would be easier to contain. Anomalies that exist alone can be debated indefinitely, but anomalies that repeat demand a different explanation, and the waters around the second island offer exactly that repetition. Sonar surveys conducted along the second site's coastline during a federal mapping initiative in the early 2000s detected submerged stone formations at shallow depth. These were not natural reef structures or glacial debris. They were linear, arranged in converging patterns, positioned at angles consistent with artificial channeling. The formations extended from shore into the tidal zone, partially buried under centuries of sediment, but still coherent enough to register on acoustic imaging. And what makes the formations significant is not their shape, but their effect. Tidal flow data from the same survey showed abnormal water behavior near the stone channels. Current moved in directions and velocities that diverged from the surrounding baseline, patterns consistent with water directed through a partially collapsed conduit, rather than flowing freely across open seabed. Marine engineers reviewing the data noted the resemblance to Oak Island's flood tunnel intakes at Smith's Cove. The scale was different, the preservation was worse, but the underlying principle, using the tide itself as a hydraulic engine to pressurize a subsurface chamber, appeared identical. If this interpretation holds, the builders did not construct one preservation system. They constructed 2 on separate islands using the same engineering philosophy, calibrated to the specific tidal conditions of each location. That level of redundancy does not belong to pirates or amateurs. It belongs to an organization that understood the value of what it was hiding and refused to trust that value to a single site. Soil does not lie. It does not revise testimony under pressure or redact inconvenient details from the record. Whatever passes through it leaves a chemical signature, and if you know how to read that signature, the soil will tell you what was there long after every other witness has gone silent. Core samples extracted from Oak Island over the past century have consistently shown anomalous concentrations of 2 elements with no natural business appearing together in the geology of a small Atlantic island. The first is gold, not as coins or artifacts, but as trace particulate distributed through soil at depths consistent with long-term storage. The second is mercury, elemental mercury in concentrations, suggesting deliberate placement rather than environmental contamination. Individually, either element could be explained away. Gold particulate might migrate from a single buried object over centuries. Mercury might appear through some obscure geological mechanism, but their co-occurrence at the same depths, in the same profiles, in ratios recurring across multiple boreholes resists casual explanation. Now at a second data point, the 1965 expedition to the second island reportedly retrieved soil samples containing the same anomalous pairing. Gold traces and mercury together at comparable depths. The original analysis was never published, never independently verified, and the samples have not been located since the lead researcher's death. The data exists only as a claim, unconfirmed but unrefuted. Within Templar-adjacent esoteric traditions, mercury and gold are not random materials. They occupy the two poles of alchemical transformation, mercury as the volatile principle, gold as the fixed. Their combination carried symbolic and ritualistic weight in traditions the Templars encountered during their centuries in the East. Whether read as mysticism or chemistry, the pairing is not accidental in any framework that takes Templar intellectual history seriously. Two sites, the same impossible soil chemistry, one confirmed, one reported but unverified. The coincidence required to explain this grows more elaborate with every detail, while the alternative remains stubbornly simple. It would be irresponsible to go further without considering the possibility that none of this means what it appears to mean. Every piece of evidence assembled so far, the tunnels, the geometry, the maps, the soil chemistry, the second site, has an alternative explanation. Those alternatives deserve more than a dismissive sentence before the narrative moves on. They deserve the same weight given to the mystery itself. Geologists have argued for decades that the Oak Island flood tunnels may not be engineered at all. The island sits on a karst-like limestone substrate riddled with natural voids. Seawater infiltration through porous bedrock is documented along this coastline, and the flooding of excavation shafts could be entirely explained by natural hydrology without invoking a single deliberate tunnel. The coconut fiber found at Smith's Cove, skeptics suggest, may have arrived as packing material from colonial shipping. Mundane debris washed ashore and compacted into the beach over centuries. The geometric alignments fare no better under scrutiny. The human mind is extraordinarily skilled at finding patterns in randomness, and when you plot enough points on a small island, some will inevitably align with sacred ratios or architectural proportions. This is confirmation bias at scale, the tendency to notice alignments that fit and discard those that do not. As for the second site, ground-penetrating radar anomalies are not rare along the Atlantic coast. Glacial deposits, root systems, natural cavitation, and sediment shifts can all produce subsurface signatures that resemble artificial structures to an eye that wants to see them. Every thread in this investigation can be cut with a mundane explanation that is not comfortable after 6 chapters of escalating evidence, but intellectual honesty is not required to feel satisfying. It is required to be honest, and the honest position at this moment is that coincidence has not yet been ruled out. The romantic appeal of Templar ships sailing west into the vast and unknown Atlantic is powerful. It is also, according to a significant body of mainstream scholarship, almost certainly fiction. Historians who reject the Templar Atlantic theory begin with a straightforward observation about the order's operational focus. The Knights Templar were a Mediterranean institution. Their infrastructure, supply lines, strategic interests, and military engagements were oriented entirely toward the Holy Land and its surrounding theater. The fleet at La Rochelle, while real, was primarily a logistical link between Atlantic France and Mediterranean operations. Nothing in the surviving Templar administrative record suggests any institutional interest in westward exploration. There are no planning documents, no provisioning orders for long-range voyages, no correspondence referencing lands beyond the known European horizon. Then there is the question of navigational capability. 14th century Atlantic navigation was coastal and cautious. Open ocean crossing required knowledge of prevailing winds, currents, and celestial positioning that European mariners did not reliably possess until the Portuguese advances of the 15th century. The Templar fleet, however capable in Mediterranean waters, would have faced a crossing of over 2,000 miles with no confirmed waypoints, no established routes, and no guarantee of landfall. The argument that they crossed successfully and then returned to encode coordinates demands navigational sophistication that most maritime historians consider plainly anachronistic. And beneath all of this lies the most damaging absence. No confirmed Templar artifact has ever been recovered from North American soil. Not a coin, not a seal, not a blade, not a single object bearing the Red Cross or any identifiable Templar insignia. 2 centuries of excavation on Oak Island have produced tantalizing fragments, bits of chain, scraps of parchment, traces of metal, but nothing independently authenticated as Templar in origin. This is the weight the theory must carry. Without a physical artifact, the entire framework rests on inference, pattern, and the suggestive alignment of circumstantial threads. That may be enough to sustain a question. It is not yet enough to confirm an answer. The skeptical position is coherent. It accounts for much of the evidence and demands nothing extraordinary. But coherence is not completeness. And if the counter-narrative is going to displace the mystery, it must explain all of the evidence, not just the pieces that yield to ordinary interpretation. Start with the flood tunnels. The geological argument that seawater infiltrates naturally through porous limestone is credible in isolation, but it does not account for the coconut fiber. And coconut fiber is not native to Nova Scotia. It was found packed in dense mats at Smith's Cove, positioned consistent with deliberate filtration, the same technique used in Mediterranean harbor construction to prevent sediment from clogging intake channels. Natural hydrology does not lay coconut fiber in engineered formations. Neither does it deposit ship's putty at precise 10-foot intervals inside a vertical shaft. Now consider the geometry. Confirmation bias is a legitimate concern, but the alignments on Oak Island were not identified by enthusiasts drawing lines on a treasure map. They were measured by licensed surveyors using calibrated instruments, and the proportional relationships correspond to documented Templar architectural ratios with margins too narrow to attribute comfortably to randomness. Then there is the artifact problem. The absence of a confirmed Templar artifact on North American soil is real and significant. But absence is only evidence of absence when the relevant ground has actually been thoroughly searched. Oak Island has never been fully excavated. The flood system has prevented it for 2 centuries. The second site has never been excavated at all. Declaring no artifact exists when the most likely locations remain sealed is a conclusion that outruns its own evidence. The skeptical narrative is tidy, but tidiness has a cost. It requires ignoring the coconut fiber, minimizing the survey data, and treating unexcavated sites as though their contents are already known. That is not skepticism. That is a different kind of faith. In 2001, a researcher working in the Vatican Secret Archive discovered a document that had been misfiled for nearly 700 years. It was not hidden in a sealed vault or locked away behind ceremonial doors. It was simply in the wrong place, cataloged under an unrelated heading, overlooked by centuries of archivists, sitting quietly in plain sight. The document was the Chinon parchment, dated August 1308. It recorded a private papal inquiry into charges against the Knights Templar, conducted by Pope Clement V himself. Its contents upended the accepted history of the order's destruction. The parchment revealed that Clement had privately absolved the Templars of heresy. The Knights had confessed under torture, recanted those confessions, and been examined by papal authority, which found them guilty of procedural violations but not of doctrinal crime. The Pope forgave them. Then he dissolved the order anyway. This reframes the entire suppression. The Templars were not destroyed because they were heretics. They were destroyed because a king wanted their wealth, and a pope lacked the political power to stop him. The theological justification was a political instrument, and the Vatican knew it, because the Vatican itself produced the document proving it. The Chinon parchment raises a question the Vatican has never addressed. If a document this significant could be misfiled for 7 centuries, not destroyed, not sealed, simply lost in the organizational noise of an archive containing tens of millions of pages, what else remains unfound? What other records relating to the Templars, their assets, their final movements before dissolution, are sitting in the wrong folder, under the wrong label, waiting for someone to look in precisely the right place? So Scotland's medieval land records are remarkably thorough. Property transfers, feudal obligations, and tenancy arrangements were documented with consistency, reflecting the Crown's interest in controlling land and taxation. Records from the late 13th century are intact. Records from the mid-14th century onward are intact. But in between, during the precise years when fleeing Templars are believed to have reached Scotland following the dissolution of 1312, there is a gap. It is not gradual thinning. It is not deterioration from fire or neglect. The records stop cleanly and then resume. When they resume, new names appear on properties that previously had different holders. These new landholders have no traceable lineage before 1312. Their family names do not appear in earlier Scottish records, or their wealth has no documented origin. They arrive in the registry as though they had always been there, holding estates in regions including the Western Highlands and coastal lowlands, areas with direct access to Atlantic shipping routes. A gap this precise does not occur naturally in an otherwise meticulous system. Records do not selectively vanish from a single narrow window unless someone with authority decided that the information was better erased. Then pages were removed during a specific period, and the entries that replaced them introduced a new class of landholder with no prior documentation. The Scottish crown at this time was under Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by the same papacy that dissolved the Templars. Scotland existed outside papal jurisdiction, a sanctuary for men fleeing papal arrest. If the Templars needed a destination where the church could not reach them and where the local king had reason to welcome skilled military men, Scotland was the only viable option in Christian Europe. The registry gap does not name the Templars. It does not need to. The shape of what was removed tells you what was being hidden, and the precision of the removal tells you that whoever arranged it had access to the machinery of the Scottish state. His name was William Barrett, and he worked as a land surveyor in Nova Scotia during the 1860s and 1870s. His professional output was unremarkable. Boundary assessments, property demarcations, the quiet work of measuring a colony into legal parcels. His official surveys were filed with the provincial land office, but his private journals, containing observations he chose not to include in any report, were not discovered until 2004, when a homeowner in Chester found them sealed inside a wall during renovation. The journals are written in his hand, on paper consistent with the period. They are not personal diaries. They read as field notes, precise, observational, and stripped of sentiment. Scattered across several entries are references to stone markers on 2 islands along the coast. One island is identified by a name that no longer appears on any modern map. The other is described only by position relative to known landmarks. Barrett's descriptions of the markers are detailed. He sketches their shape, notes orientation, and records symbols carved into their faces. The symbols, as later analysis confirmed, correspond to variations of the Templar cross, not the single iconic form most people recognize, but regional variants documented in European commanderies across France, Portugal, and Scotland. Barrett did not identify them as Templar. He had no framework for doing so. He simply recorded what he saw. He never published these observations. He never mentioned them in official filings. The journals were sealed inside a wall of a house he is believed to have owned, and he placed there for either safekeeping or concealment. Whether Barrett understood the significance of what he found is unknowable. What is knowable is that he made a deliberate choice to keep it out of the public record, and that choice held for over a century. The Halifax Customs Ledger for 1879 is not a dramatic document. It is a routine bureaucratic record of incoming goods, timber, hardware, provisions, logged by clerks who had no particular reason to think anyone would ever read their entries a full century later. But one line, dated that November, contains an entry with no satisfactory explanation. 2 crates arrived at Halifax port from an unnamed island. Contents were listed as stone fragments. Origin unknown. No shipper was identified. No vessel name was recorded. The entry notes only that the crates were directed to 2 separate destinations. One went to the Provincial Museum. The other was listed with a receiving address corresponding to no known institution, business, or private residence in the city's 1879 directory. The museum crates can be traced. It entered the collection and was eventually cataloged under a generic heading, Miscellaneous Colonial Debris. The fragments were never analyzed, never displayed, never referenced in any publication. They sat in storage, absorbed into the mass of uncategorized objects that accumulates in every museum basement. The second crate cannot be traced. It entered the customs record and vanished. No receiving signature exists. No warehouse log confirms arrival. The listed address leads nowhere. A physical object heavy enough to require customs processing crossed into the official record and then ceased to exist within it. Objects do not disappear from bureaucratic systems without help. It's a crate arriving at a port, is handled, transported, delivered. If never delivered, someone intervened. If delivered to an address that does not exist, the address was fabricated, meaning the diversion was planned before the crate reached shore. Whatever those stones were, someone wanted them and wanted no record of having taken them. There is a technique used in art and in forensic analysis that involves studying not the object itself, but the space around it. The shape of what is missing can tell you as much as the shape of what remains. When that principle is applied to this investigation, what emerges is not a scattering of unrelated gaps, but a single coherent outline, the silhouette of something systematically removed from the historical record. Begin with the fleet, 18 or more Templar ships, confirmed at port days before the arrests, gone by morning with no manifest, no destination, no trace at any receiving harbor in Europe. That is not a gap. That is an extraction. The Treasury, the most well-funded institution in Christendom, its vaults emptied before the king's soldiers arrived, its location never revealed, despite years of interrogation across multiple countries. That is not a loss. That is a relocation executed under total operational security. the Scottish land records, a precise gap in an otherwise meticulous system, covering exactly the years when displaced Templars would have needed absorption into a new country without leaving evidence of origin. That is not decay. That is erasure. The 1965 expedition. A team reaches the second site, retrieves samples, and then produces no report, no paper, no institutional record. The lead researcher dies. The data vanishes. That is not an oversight. That is suppression. The second crate, a physical object, enters the custom system at Halifax and disappears into a fabricated address. That is not a clerical error. That is planned diversion. Each of these silences, taken alone, might be explained by coincidence, incompetence, or bad luck. But they do not exist alone. They cluster around a single subject, the Templars, their assets, and the possibility of sites in Atlantic Canada with a density that transcends accident. When silence recurs this consistently, indeed across this many centuries and institutions, the silence itself becomes evidence, not of what happened, but of the effort required to ensure that no one could prove it did. The Knights Templar invented modern banking. They created credit notes allowing a pilgrim to deposit funds at one commandery and withdraw equivalent value at another, hundreds of miles away, without physically transporting currency. They managed assets across multiple kingdoms, maintained parallel ledgers, and built redundancy into every layer of their operations. They understood better than any institution of their era that concentration was vulnerability. This is the foundation of the two-vault hypothesis. It begins with a simple question: would an organization that never trusted a single point of failure for its banking trust, a single location for its most irreplaceable holdings? The logic suggests not. If the Templars relocated their treasury, and the evidence strongly implies they did, they would have followed the same principles governing their financial architecture. Critical assets would be divided. Redundancy would be standard. No single loss could be total. Under this model, Oak Island and the second site are not alternatives. They are complements. One may function as the primary vault. The other may serve as a secondary repository, a failsafe, or a decoy designed to absorb attention while true holdings remain undisturbed. All three configurations align with Templar operational thinking, and none can be eliminated without excavating both sites, something never done. The implications are severe. If the hypothesis holds, then every dollar spent on Oak Island, every expedition, every engineering effort over the past 2 centuries has addressed, at most, half the system. The flood tunnels, the boreholes, the sonar surveys have all been directed at one node of a paired structure, while the other sits untouched, unexcavated, and largely unknown. Oak Island may yet contain something extraordinary, but if it was designed as one half of a divided whole, then understanding it requires finding the other half, and the other half has been hiding in silence this entire time. His name does not appear in any major published history of Oak Island. He was not famous or wealthy, not affiliated with the large syndicates that dominated the 20th century search. He was a private individual with modest resources and an obsession that consumed 2 decades. He studied the money pit, corresponded with researchers, and built a personal archive, his family later described as extensive and meticulously organized. By the early 1950s, he had become convinced Oak Island was not the complete picture. His correspondence from this period, preserved by a relative, contains repeated references to a second site described in terms suggesting independent identification, and possibly through encoded coordinate data that other researchers would not publish for another 30 years. Unlike academics who noted the anomaly and moved on, he acted. In the summer of 1953, he made a trip. It lasted less than 2 weeks. He traveled alone, or possibly with one companion, whose identity was never confirmed. He went to an island that was not Oak Island. When he returned, everything changed. He stopped all research. He dismantled his archive. He declined every interview request, including from journalists who had previously found him eager to talk. His family described a man who had become quiet in a way that did not resemble disappointment. It resembled fear. He never discussed what he saw or found. He carried it in silence for the remaining decades of his life, and when he died, no account of the trip was found among his possessions. A man who finds nothing does not behave this way. He comes home frustrated, restless, ready to plan the next attempt. He does not destroy his archive. He does not retreat from a subject that defined his adult life. That withdrawal belongs to someone who found something exceeding his capacity to act, something that made pursuit feel dangerous in a way it never had before. His silence was not failure. It was the quiet of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, that some doors are not meant to be opened alone. The second island exists. Its coordinates can be approximated. Its geometric footprint has been measured. Its subsurface anomalies have been recorded by radar and sonar, and yet not a single controlled archaeological excavation has ever been conducted there. The question of why leads not into wilderness, but into a thicket of paperwork, jurisdictional silence, and institutional resistance, far more difficult to navigate than any forest. Ownership of the island is unresolved. The property sits within a tangle of generational land disputes that have never been adjudicated. Multiple families claim partial title through inheritance lines that diverge in the 19th century and were never formally reconciled. No single entity holds a clear deed, which means no single entity can grant excavation rights. This alone would be enough to stall any research initiative, but it is not the only barrier. Access requires permits from provincial authorities. Now, several researchers have applied over the past 2 decades. Their applications were denied. In each case, the denial came without public explanation, without written justification, and without any indication of what criteria were not met. Appeals were ignored or returned without comment. One researcher described the process as encountering a wall with no visible source, but absolute structural integrity. This pattern does not match mere indifference. Indifference produces neglect, not resistance. A government that does not care about a small uninhabited island simply ignores permit requests or processes them routinely. It does not actively deny them and then refuse to explain why. Active denial requires a conscious decision, and that decision requires someone with knowledge sufficient to determine that access should not be granted. The island remains untouched, not because no one has tried to reach it, but because every single attempt through legitimate channels has been quietly, firmly, and inexplicably turned away. This is the reframing that hurts the most, because it does not ask whether the mystery is real. It asks whether we have been solving the wrong one. Imagine you are designing a system to protect something irreplaceable. You have engineering knowledge to build underground vaults, hydraulic seals, and flood mechanisms calibrated to defeat excavation for centuries. You have 2 remote islands on a coastline no European power has claimed. You have a fleet, a treasury, and the discipline of a military order under existential threat. You do not build one vault, you build 2, and you make one visible. Oak Island was never hidden. The depression was findable. The tackle block on the oak tree practically invited investigation. The platforms appeared at regular intervals as though designed to reward just enough progress to keep diggers returning. You knew the flood tunnels activated at precisely the depth needed to prevent reaching bottom, while ensuring the attempt itself became legendary. Every failed expedition added to the mythology. Every treasure hunter who poured money into the pit and walked away empty-handed made the next attempt inevitable. The island became the most famous unsolved mystery in the Western Hemisphere, consuming all available attention. No one looked elsewhere because Oak Island gave them just enough reason never to stop looking here. If this was the design, it has worked flawlessly. For 2 centuries, every resource, every theory, every dollar has been directed at a single island, while a second site sits in undisturbed silence. Oak Island was not the vault, it was the lock. And every expedition that tried to break it only proved how well it was built. There is no ending to this story. That is not a limitation of the research. It is the point. The second island exists. The geometric parallels between its features and Oak Island have been independently measured. The subsurface anomalies have been recorded. The title signatures suggest collapsed infrastructure consistent with flood mechanisms. The soil chemistry, where briefly sampled, matches the anomalous profile found at Oak Island. The archival gaps form a coherent and unmistakable pattern of concealment spanning 7 centuries. All of this is documented. None of it is resolved, because the single act that would convert this evidence into confirmation or refutation has never been performed. No archaeologist has broken ground on the second island under controlled conditions. No excavation permit has been granted. No institution has committed resources to answering the question that every preceding chapter has been building toward. The island sits where it has always been. The ground is intact. The silence around it is maintained by legal entanglement, bureaucratic obstruction, and what can only be described as a profound institutional unwillingness to look. This documentary does not end with an answer. It ends with the weight of a question that has been available for 200 years and has never been formally asked. Not because evidence was insufficient, not because the location was unknown, but because every system that could have asked it chose instead to keep digging on Oak Island. The pit that refused to be empty may have served its true purpose after all. It kept the whole world looking down while the real question waited quietly somewhere else.